David, hello and welcome.
Hello, and welcome back, Aileen. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's really amazing to have you here on our podcast. So thank you for your time. Um, so as you know, this is all about perfectionism. We explore perfectionism in different areas and how it affects people. So I just wanted to ask you, perfectionism, where does it go to for you? How far do you remember? When did you start noticing what it is all about?
I think I can reflect back to sort of childhood. So more so like the transition from junior school into sort of like high school. And although I didn't know that it was perfectionism at the time, one of the things that I used to do was, you would make notes in class from, like from whatever was, like going on. But when I came home, I would redo, like all of my notes, because they weren't neat enough. And that's not because I couldn't read them. There was just that level of, I want that to be neater. I want it to be on a straight line. I don't want these, like scribbles. And that didn't necessarily mean that I did it for everything, because sort of, like maths is maths. So like, it's difficult to redo that. Which probably might explain why I never really got very far with maths. It's not one of my favorite, not one of my favorite topics.
Okay.
But everything else, I used to bring back, and it was right. Like I would sit down and I would, I would rewrite it so that everything was neat, and then sort of, things would be in folders, and there would be, like dividers, and it was a place for everything, and everything was, was in its place. And I think equally, part of that was, nothing in the house. If I sort of like go to sort of like what my parents were like, nothing in there. You didn't drop things on the floor and leave them there.
Yeah.
If something needed put away, it was, it had a place. And my mom was very very particular around sort of like routine. So if you sat down with mom and said, right, describe your week, it would be Monday I clean this room, Tuesday I clean this room, Wednesday I clean this room, and all the way through. And even sort of like meals were, Monday it's this, Tuesday it's this, so it was almost like, looking back, it was almost like going to a guest house. It was like, what's on the menu today. So from my perspective, like that all of that coming together,
Order.
of right, it's routine. Everything has to have its place, and it didn't, so like rewriting things just seemed normal. It was that, right, like keep everything neat. It has to be, for me, it has to be at that level.
And so when did you start noticing that is not being helpful, or or tying it up to perfectionism?
Yeah, I mean, it was a sort of like a big, sort of like a big time gap before I started to realize what, like what perfectionism was, giving it that label. And that came about, long into sort of like employment, when I made the transition from sort of like a management career into sort of like learning and development. And making that move into learning and development, all of these things, like come up, you're like in books, and then you're like, all of a sudden you've got this, you're like, this is something called perfectionism, and you sort of, you have a look at it and you go, that looks a bit, there are some things in there that seem to be a bit familiar. And that was the point that, this whole thing of, right, like, what is it, and how, what impact does it have, and how does it affect, the things moving forward? Because when it's all going on, until somebody actually says, do you think that what you're doing is, is good for you? So like, is it healthy? Is there an upside? Is there a downside? You don't know. It's like a lot of things until you get that, you like that sort of like piece of feedback, and then you start making sort of like other connections with, stuff that's going on. So once I got into so like the career path of learning and development, and I started to recognize that there's more to this than meets the eye. Like it's research. There is there's like reference to it.
Mm.
That was the point that I started to think, okay, so this, it has its benefits, but there could be some some downsides to this as well.
Yeah.
So it was as I say, so well into employment, and the other thing, so like I find around that as well, is that depending on your personality type, on any profile, I'm quite strongly introverted. And what that means is that, so when you keep yourself to yourself, you don't expose yourself to the be perfect piece, because people don't necessarily see it, because you're not engaged with as many people. But the more that the more you start working in a team, the more you start working in an organization, and people are aware of the work that you're doing, especially in a learning and development environment where you're putting courses together or you're delivering courses,
Yeah.
then all of a sudden it's other people can see the things that you can't see. So they then start to give you that additional information of, was that not good enough? Yeah, no. Thank you, it wasn't.
Yeah.
And there were other things as well, that and I'm just going to sort of throw this out there because we might come back to it. Is that and I'm not sure that there's a connection here, but I'm wondering if there is, that because I've got this sort of be perfect driver that I'm aware of, there are certain things that if something breaks, in the house and is not working, it absolutely drives me nuts. Okay, until it's fixed. Okay?
Right.
And that can be a bulb can go out, and I can live with that because it's right. Okay, you're like, I'll change that at some point. But if anything breaks that I can't fix, yeah, like anything around plumbing or anything bigger around electrics,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not working perfectly, yeah, it bugs me, and it drives me nuts until it's fixed.
Mm.
So anything like that happens, it's for me, that's not working, and I'm usually straight into the Yellow Pages or Google to find somebody to fix it and say, look, make it work, make it work quickly. And then if there's a time span, the longer it goes where it's not working the way that I want it to, the more stressed I get. I don't know whether there's a connection there, but it just seems that there's some sort of causal link between the
Yeah,
two.
somehow it's causing you that stress, um, and I wonder what you tie it up with in terms of, is it because it's just not working and you want it working because it's affecting the practicalities of your day? If the light isn't working, or the plug isn't working, it means your work is delayed or something.
Yeah,
And
and it's not just so like work things. I mean, if I put my sort of PC on in the morning and the internet's down,
uh,
I almost go into meltdown. Yeah, you should
don't
be
we
well,
all?
because my first thought is not that the internet's down and that's why I can't get onto the internet or I can't do email. It's my PC's broken. Yeah, and I don't know how to fix that, because and if a PC breaks, and everything stops. It's like work stops. We don't have calls like this, and I can't do email, and I can't do meetings.
Mm.
But it's also household things. The flush mechanism, on the toilet, wasn't working properly, and it was driving me insane,
Mm.
literally. So
Is that
you're like, and the thing with that as well is that when you've got something like that, you can't escape it. Every time you go in the bathroom, even if even if you're not going to use the flusher, you go in the bathroom and And I've had, I've had conversations, with the toilet, asking it to work properly. I've actually been standing there saying, look, I'm not asking for anything dramatic. You're a toilet, you should flush. You should flush properly. Why won't you just work and take away the stress? And it may sound like trite and humorous, but it's because it's going around my head constantly of that thing's not working. It's not working. It's not working the way that it should. It should be perfect. It should be working perfectly.
It's not, if you think about that orderly life that you had as a child, that you grew up with, everything had an order, and your mom's menu for each day of the week and so on, nothing on the floor. It seems like, okay, so things are done for certain use and they should be doing their job. And is there something there that if you were able to repair it, it would be within your control, but because you're not able to repair the flush and you kind of are in need of someone else coming and sorting it out for you, do you think that might have something to do with that frustration, that you're not in control of doing something about it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There are I wouldn't say pure control issues, but there is that, when you have literally no capability to do something because it's completely outside of your your skill set. And or to use the expression that I've heard recently, it's well outside of my wheelhouse, which I've got no idea what that means. Is that you're reliant then on on other people, and then one of the things I find with that is if I'm looking for a coach and mentor, or anything to do with learning development, I know what I'm looking for because I've got that experience. But when you're engaging with somebody to do something that you have no experience about, like an electrician or a plumber, like in my case, it's you're relying on that person to say, yeah, of course I know what I'm doing, and I'm at the top of my game, so you're like, don't worry about it. But you don't know, because I've got nothing to do. Now, fortunately, there's one thing that will drive me insane more than anything else. It's if my water feature in my garden stops working. It's the one place of solace that I have. So when it stops, it's very much, it's stopped, I need it fixed. And then you get into this, almost dilemma of, right, well, is it an electrical issue or is it a landscape gardening issue? And fortunately, I called an electrician who went out and said, look, I know exactly what what the problem is. And he turned out to be an absolute miracle worker, professional, top of his game, really nice person. And consequently, when I said, don't suppose you know how to fix toilets, do you? He said, no, but I know a really good plumber that I would recommend. And lo and behold. So I've now got two people that I can go, right, if I've got any plumbing problems, it's this person. If I've got any electrical problems, it's this person. They're both really nice. They work in different ways. And to me, they provide a level of perfectionism. Yeah. You could say professionalism, but I would lean towards what they do to me. It's not just fixed, it's fixed perfectly. And that is the difference, because if you take the water feature, and what he said was, look, as it was, a slug had crawled into one of the sockets, and it had given its life, to kill my water feature, for want of a better description. And he said, right, you need cables, and you need a whole load of things sorted. I can do that. It'll be a lot better than the way that it was. That is a perfect fix. he could have equally said, look, like I've taken slug out, I've wrapped some tape around the wires, you're like, it's working here. That would have been a fix as well. It would have been working. But I would have looked at that and gone, that's not perfect. Under any circumstances, that is not what I want.
That wouldn't make up.
Now that you've tempted me with this, perfectionism of you can have this and you can have this and you can have this. That's what I want.
Yeah. So
it's a higher, it's got to be that higher level.
Not everyone can actually fulfill those standards.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. Okay. So how now that you told me with feedback you started recognizing the perfectionist inside, and what was your reflection? Because I think Les Brown that said, when you are inside the frame, you can't see the picture. So someone kind of tells you, and as coaches, for example, that's also part of what we do. We kind of show people what's inside that frame, how the picture looks like. So once that started happening, how did that affect you? How did that affect your life? How did that affect your beliefs about the world and yourself? And how did that affect your work with, in the corporate world with executives and leaders, and when you were, doing team development, team coaching, and organizational development? How did that affect that work? And were you then able to recognize better the perfectionists in that corporate world as well?
Okay, so if I can sort of unpick all of that, so like into
there was a lot there.
Yeah, into something so in my own logical structure. You're absolutely right. It's very similar to you can't see the wood from the trees. Sorry, you can't see the wood for the trees, because when you're in something, when you're immersed in it, you're like, this is my world, and until somebody comes along and says something different. But what's the important thing around feedback as well that I also learned was that if you have a personality which is very much the if you take a report, for example, right, your report is very good. Here are some additional areas that would improve it for next time. One person might hear that, okay, great, you're like, thank you very much for the feedback, I really appreciate that. And that's it. End of story. However, if you have a strong perfectionism drive, of it must be perfect, I must be perfect for you, what you hear is, that report is rubbish, you've made so many mistakes in it, it's not right, it is not perfect because there are things that you could have done. And one of the things that I started to notice, and again, in the same way that when I moved into learning development, I reflected on what was going on in school and home and picking those things out. When I became more and more aware of sort of coaching, and did my coaching qualifications and other master's degrees and things like that, and a lot of work on personality and assessments and psychology, I started to reflect back on those moments as well of, right, what is it that's making me see that, as opposed to just feedback is useful, it's a way forward. So thinking about the things that happen within the corporate world that started to make these changes, one of the things was when somebody labels you as David is the perfectionism in the group, or David is the detail conscious one, there are two things happen. Number one, you can adapt and adopt that label, so that that's who you are. So, the reason I do this is because I'm a perfectionist and I'm detail conscious. But also everybody else can tag into that as well, and say, right, well, can you just check this over because you're the perfectionist, you're the one who's detail conscious? Yeah, right. Or
Right. So
but you
you
get a
end
bit of
up
work,
spending
and
more
then you get some
time
more, and then you and everything comes to you because. And yeah, I'll share an example if I may. I
please.
was I was working, so before I sort of got higher up in learning development, I was regional training manager. We were having a sort of a team meeting, and the organizational development director had tasked all the team members to come up with a new series of icebreakers for the programs that we were running.
Mhm.
So yeah, as you might expect, quite a lot of people had contacted me and said, like, how are you getting on with this? And I was saying, well, I've got loads. What do you want some? Yeah. Could you send some through? So yeah, so I was like distributing these like to most people in the team. So so we're going around the team meeting. So it starts with me. You're like, what have you got? And I said, well, I've got all of these, and there are these additional books and these additional resources. Blah 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 blah. Okay, well, that's like that's really good. And then started to go around the rest of the team, who all said, oh yeah, David helped me out with like some of this, blah 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 blah. Yeah, next one, David. And then the organizational director just stopped the meeting and says, look, says in future, should I just go to David and like just ask him to do it? Because clearly that's all you've done.
How did that feel for you? What was going on there with you?
It's, I mean, for me, it was, and still is. Like if somebody contacts me now, in the roles that I've got, my own organisation, my role within the IAPC&M as a mentor, so like with the Chartered Management Institute, it's exactly saying like, do you know anything about? If I do, it'll be like this is what it is. Here are some books and like resources. Here's like some stuff I've got on the computer. If I don't, I find it incredibly difficult, if nigh on impossible, depending upon what the topic is, to just go back and go, no. Yeah. What I'm more likely to do is to get into Google and I'll research it. And it'll be right. Okay, you're like what here are some like resources for you. You're like, go away and do that.
Even if you have piles of work to do,
Even if I've got piles of work to do. Yeah.
still would like to.
My response to people when they're asking things so like is always a priority over like whatever else. So I might delay it and say, right, you're like give me a chance to get back to you if it's on a topic that is completely like away from anything that that I know about. So again, going back to my, so if it was if it was finance, or if somebody was asking about I was going to say insurance, but I generally point people to a number of places for that. Probably not about if it was about nuclear physics, for example. Not that I've ever been asked about that, but it would be, look, you're like, I don't know. But even then, so like it would be what I generally do is whatever the question is, I just copy and paste it into Google and then just send them the link and go, look, just keep ask Google, just pop it in there. But the thing around, and you're right, is that it pulls you away from other bodies of work. And if you've got a body of work to do that's outside of your comfort zone, a new skill that you're learning, for example, and I've got an assignment that falls into that category, you delay it a little bit because part of you is saying this assignment needs to be perfect, and it fights against but at the minute you don't have the knowledge and the skills and the experience to just like rattle that together. Even though people, other people are still saying, well, of course you do. I mean, look at all the look at everything that you're doing. I say, yeah, you're right. And you almost negate and neglect, that piece of work coming in. So going back to like one of your, so you've got the labeling and the pigeonhole bit, but equally, so on a positive side, you also start to notice other things. So before I moved in purely into sort of like senior learning development, shall we say, and sort of being head of country, head of Europe, and what have you, I did some consultancy work. And so as a training and development, like consultancy, boutique consultancy. And one of the things you had to do was like go and like sit down with like usually directors or managing directors or CEOs and things like that. And when I first started, I was incredibly wary of I'm not worthy.
Mm.
I'm not a director, so how can I be sitting in front of you saying, well, like what you really want to do is. And I can't remember exactly when it was, but it was when I was visiting one person, CEO of the organization, and I just had this. You could call it a light bulb moment, or you could call it sort of like an epiphany. Because when he was like chatting about something, and the facilities director had sort of given me a little bit of a tour of the organization before we sat down, and he was just chatting away, and there was just that moment where I just completely relaxed and just thought, you know what, this is just two people having a conversation.
Mhm.
And there was that transition from like, yeah, you've got a different title, you've got more experience in certain areas, but that does not make us unequal. That means that we can have a different conversation about different things. And he made it, I can't remember the exact comment, but he was talking about the organizational structure and said something along the lines of, it's important for me to be able to do this. You're like, what do you think? And my response, and I'm paraphrasing because I can't remember exactly, was somewhere along the lines of, well, that's really important, because if you can't do that, then you shouldn't be sitting in that chair, should you? And I remember, out of my peripheral vision, watching the facilities director almost fall off his chair.
Huge difference between that person who.
Yeah, and it was like, you do not speak to the CEO like that. And he sat there and looked at me and went, you know what, David? He said, you're like, if more people just told me what the score was, it would be like a lot easier. And I learned from that point that you show respect. You're aware of sort of like people's experiences, and everything else. But that doesn't mean that you always have to be like at a sort of like a lower level. That doesn't necessarily sort of like equate though to when you're delivering what it is that they want, that you're not going and going, oh, this has got to be perfect, like in order for. And what's interesting is that so once you start like working at that level, you're like on that equal bit, and you've still got that like whatever I deliver must be perfect, is so like the little dilemma when they turn around and they go, that was really, really good, can we have some more? And you're thinking, oh well, part of that's worked, but it drains you to try and maintain that level all of the time.
Yeah.
Like drains you. And I found the same so like initially with like team building and so like in team development, team coaching, that in the early stages, very similar to the sort of like the consultancy, I almost felt the need to introduce myself, not just as you're like, hi, I'm David, you're like, I'm going to be doing this today, but oh, by the way, this is the way that I work, and I tend to do this and I tend to do that. Almost creating that level of, look, like you're going to get a level of like perfectionism. This is who I am. And over time, I learned that, look, I don't need to do that. I don't need to tell people that, oh, by the way, because they'll experience that anyway.
Yeah. So trying to convince them also that level, because the thing about the perfectionism is people that are proud of those high standards, and having high standards, there's nothing wrong with that. It's the bar going up constantly, and focusing on the mistakes rather than the achievements.
Oh yeah.
So, and how did you, or how do you find when you're working with executives and with teams, do you find yourself spotting the perfectionists, and how does that affect the work and the the organizational development initiatives and team development and so on? How do you find that it's affecting your work with the organization?
It's the one area that it's noticeable is anything to do with delegation, anything to do with decision making, anything to do with team expectation. Because if you've got somebody so like who is sort of high in the like everything in the garden must be rosy, everything must be perfect, then delegation is a bit of an issue because it's nobody's ever going to be able to do it as well as I can. Or they'll delegate it and then they'll check it and redo it, which is a complete waste of time because it's duplicated. And and for the person who's doing it, it's a bit like, well, like, do you not trust me? No, it's not that I don't trust you. It's just that I'm going to check your work and redo it. It's got nothing to do with trust. So part of that conversation is, okay, well, you're like, how do you think that's going to be perceived? Like, how do you think that's going to be taken? All right, I have expectations of my team. Well, everybody has expectations of your team, but like, at what point, like, are those expectations unrealistic? How are you communicating that? Now, within so like certainly within all coaching, there is the what is the goal? And one of the things that I've become more and more aware of is, and I do not want to be pilloried or shot or chased around social media for the following comment, is that like this, there is this all goals are achievable by those people like they're going to be that we're going to coach, because everybody has it within themselves to be great. And I sort of go, I don't really believe that, to be honest, because I don't think that's necessarily the case.
You want to be a rock star.
Yeah. I mean, you might be. You're like, there will always be, there will always be something. Sorry, just bear with me a second while the rag and bone man, so like, just decided to go past.
Okay.
There we go. And so one of the things that I became acutely aware of was, right, you've got to have the ability to do the thing that it is that you want to do, and then tagged with that, you need to have the the motivation, in the commitment. But if you can't, if you literally can't do it, that's not to say that you wouldn't be able to do it, but you need something else. You need either training or development or a different element of coaching, or mentoring, in my opinion. And so one of the things, when working with people, is very much this, the comment that you made about, if you're in the picture, you can't see the frame. You've got to take that, that step back. And I find the best way to do that is, because as a coach, you only ever see the person for a snapshot, so you still only get one side of the conversation. So no matter how good a coach you are, even with the best intuition in the world, you can only work with what your client tells you, unless you're there, and you're observing, or you're with a team and you're watching them, do something. Yeah. So getting them to get feedback from the people around them, I find is one of the best ways, because then you can say, well, okay, look, talk to the people that see you on a daily basis. Yeah. And if you have the courage, go and ask your family what you like. Yeah, because a lot of people say, well, I'm like this at work, but I'm not like this at home, which always engenders the, okay, well, will the real person please stand up then? Because it's rare that, and then there was a Marshall Goldsmith tells a very good story, which I'll shorten, but it was essentially, working with guys said, well, look, I'm not like this at home, and he simply said, look, are your wife and kids at home at the minute? Yes. Let's ring them up and ask them, shall we? So he rang them up and asked them, and and he said, when they'd finished laughing, they said, no, you're exactly like this at home as well. So don't be under any illusions that you're any different. And he said, at that point, he put the phone down. He went, yeah, okay, maybe I might need some coaching in this area. And that is there are two things around that. One is this awareness piece, but one is also the acceptance of either I'm either going to accept myself as I am and not do anything about it, but be aware of it, or I'm going to accept this and do something about it. Yeah. And yeah, and sometimes there might be some sort of trade-off, and there might be some balance between it. But it's there is a quote which I often it's like using quotes all the time, but one of the ones that I tend to make reference to is, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing is going to change until it's faced. And like within that is that, well, look, is my level of perfectionism going to change? Okay, yes, no. And if the answer to that is no, the next question has to be, well, okay, so what am I going to do about it? How am I going to use my awareness of what it is to make sure that it doesn't get in the way? But equally, how am I going to use what it is to really, like, for some things to be, like, really, really good? Going back to childhood, I used to make a lot of, I saw like model airplanes, like from kits. And if the kit, for whatever reason, didn't fit properly, it wouldn't be a case of, all right, I'll just, make do. It went in the bin. It was like, well, that's not perfect. That doesn't work. Like the way it goes. That was just something I reflected on while I was talking, and so it popped into my head there. And that means that, the reason that we do something is there's some sort of payoff. That there's a reason why. So I could comfortably say, well, okay, why do you like doing detail? Why do you keep doing it? Why is good enough not good enough? And it's, well, for me, so like, I like the detail. I like to dig. I like to explore. But I'm also mindful that through experience, there are lots and lots of other people out there that will find that incredibly frustrating and incredibly annoying, because there is that like element of, well, that's not the way that I do things. Like for me, good enough is good enough is something that I'd love to, I'd love to attain, because at the minute it's like, that'll do, and that's it,
I guess it's also a question of, when you do that, or when, one does it in detail and it's not a problem, then it's fine, isn't it? No one needs to do really anything about something unless it is becoming a problem for yourself and also for those around you, for your family, for your children. So it's kind of the ripple effect as well, isn't it? So I guess that people first start having a reflection and start taking the first steps to change and do something about their perfectionism once they realize the cost, the price they're paying in order to keep that level of standard. And because they always focus on what's not done, it also affects their well-being as well. There's a lot of frustration and you feel down, you lose your trust in yourself and your self-worth as well, being dependent on your achievements. And I guess that is really the key point, that your self-worth is constantly dependent on your achievements. So you might be you got the fantastic job, yes, it's great, and then maybe you didn't do a good report, even though it's 80% well, 90% well, but there was a little mistake. Then your whole self-worth, you forget all about the other achievements, and your self-worth is down. I'm useless, I'm worthless, no, I'm a failure across the span of your life as well. It's not like I failed to do this report. No, I'm not good enough in general. So I think that recognizing the feedback from the other members of the team and family sounds like a really good and effective way to make people realize perhaps what's going on. So how did that work? How has that made any change in the organizations that you have been working with? How did that help?
Yeah, it's a all development starts with self-development.
Yeah.
That is the something that is the key. So one of the things that I became aware of was, I can't go into an organization and talk about something if I'm not doing, doing the work for myself. Excuse me. So if you looked at transaction analysis and you looked at the two be perfect drivers, the model suggests that anytime we are in that sort of state, we have moved away from an I'm okay, you're okay position. And we're essentially saying that, look, I'm okay if and only if I'm being perfect for you, or you're being perfect for me. And that if that first movement is the first movement into a stressed position, that if that's not met, then our behavior is going to continue to change. So as an example, it might be that, well, look, the more and more that I don't feel as if I can be perfect for you, the more and more I'm going to push for a level of attainment that is unattainable. It's just not going to happen. Conversely, if I'm saying to you, well, look, you need to be perfect for me, and you're not, and that continues, I'm going to get more picky and I'm going to get more frustrated. And at a certain point, I might get downright aggressive, around that, unless I recognize what's going on. So we need that feedback, not just to say, look, by the way, this is what we're seeing, but we need to be aware that, within our own behavior, that it can have both a positive impact, but it can also have a very negative impact. So the whole concept of how might it be perceived by other people, what are the alternatives? And not wanting to espouse everything that Marshall Goldsmith does, but one of his observations was that we develop ourselves because of what we can do, but also in spite of what we can do. So an example, assertiveness is always one of my favorite ones to quote, that you can get to a certain position in an organization because of your assertiveness, but also because some people might find that you're not assertive, that you're more aggressive. It's more of an aggressive tendency, depending upon which way you are. That you can also say, well, I've sort of got to this position, in spite of being a little bit too assertive, at times, possibly bordering on passive aggressive. And one of the things, so when you're working with people, I find whether it's teams, organizations, individuals, is that exploration. It's the, well, okay, this is your view. How else is it viewed? And there are certain things that you just have to accept as, well, that's not likely to change, or it's not likely to change soon, or I've got no intention of changing it. So then you have this, well, okay, if you're adamant that you're not going to change, not that you can't change it, but you're not going to change it, that can be a completely different conversation of, okay, so, and it's one of the classics that I'm sure a lot of coaches mentors come across, and counselors and psychotherapists, I would undoubtedly say, is the classic line of, when you provide them with some feedback of, that's just the way that I am. And it's the danger of that's just the way that I am, is it becomes a catch-all. And in my opinion, in my humble opinion, is, but don't be using that as a defense mechanism or an excuse mechanism of, that is the way that you are, but is it the way that you want to be? Is it the way that you want to continue? And if you just randomly, there is a key difference between for example, I sit down to do an assignment or a report or a bit of research, and I put everything into that to, it must be perfect, okay, or I ask somebody to do a report Yeah, and they do it. And for me, I'm saying, right, you're like, that's got to be perfect for me. So I'm putting either myself under pressure or someone else. You take that into a different scenario, like a relationship, with your partner, and you start, like either going down the route of, I've got to be perfect for you when they don't want you to be, or they don't want, need that level, or you start, like wanting your partner to be perfect for you. That's a completely different scenario. So one of the things that's really important to be aware of is, okay, when it's just us, or it's what I would call like project work, work. It's an issue, but it's not as much of an issue as it is when you've got people involved. Okay, within the organization, like within the family environment, what's the impact of imposing a "you must be perfect for me" on a child? Yeah.
I guess that there's also if it is the expectation from yourself, it's only in the case of if it's affecting other people around you, because a lot of my clients who put a lot of pressure on themselves to do everything and to do everything perfectly, and that their self-worth is dependent on never saying no, taking all the work they can, because if they say no, it means they're not good enough. Then they end up frustrated, stressed, anxious, depressed, because there's only so many hours in the day and there's only so much of them, that so much
Mm.
energy that they can have. And that starts having effect, of course, on their
Mm.
children, because they become perhaps snappy, or their relationship because they are angry with their husbands or wives, for not doing everything that they should be doing perfectly, as well. Why do I have to do everything? So, like we said earlier, the ripple effect
Mm.
of that pressure you put upon yourself, um, really um, has impact on
Oh
people.
yeah, yeah, and it's interesting. So like when you're saying about when people like when people say, oh, I just can't say no to that,
Mm.
and it's again, one of the things, excuse me, that I've learned over time is don't take that in isolation. Okay, so there's the rollback of, right, are you telling me that you've never said no to anything? Okay, no matter where that you're like in your mind, wherever that goes. We don't need to talk about it, but are you telling me that at no point have you ever said, yeah, thanks, but no?
Yeah.
And then you get you get that exploration of, okay, so what is it about this situation? Yeah. And then all of a sudden it's the norm of the perfectionism
Yeah.
starts to take on a, right, there's something about this that's different to that. Yeah. So
Situation.
for example, if I dust my office, which I have to say I do on a regular basis, it doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be clean. I just, so if I find a bit of dust, it's right, okay, I need to clean. If I look at a plant and I think, what, like you could do with a bit of water, it gets watered, but it doesn't have, I'm not measuring out the water and and things.
Mm-hmm.
But different situations, it's like, well, okay, I'm going to put this together. Yeah, that needs to be, perfect. If I'm assessing somebody against the capability model, that needs to be right. That it's assessed against that capability model, and that's it. Because that's the way that it works. So when you get into that conversation around, okay, you're like, how is it impact? What is it about that that's different to that? Okay, if you went out with friends, and also my absolute favorite question or observation of, have you told anybody about this? Have you had that conversation about what's going on? And the majority of the time it's no, I haven't. Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's, well, until you have that conversation, yeah, or until you point out that piece of behavior or what's going on with someone, it's always going to be, well, we're back to, right, well, you either live with it or you do something about it. there is I think we've had this conversation before, a film called The Stepmom with Julia Roberts, and there is a part in that where she's talking to her would be stepdaughter who's been dumped by her boyfriend. And Julia Roberts says, look, you've got two choices. You can either, and she does, with her hand, it shows scales. Says you can either do something about it or sit here crying in the snow. Do something about it or sit here crying in the snow. What do you want to do?
Yeah.
So there's always a choice. And the choice that we make is the one that, you made that choice. It's like my, I don't want to go too much off topic, but on the subject of choice in the film The Godfather, when they always make this reference to, my father made him an offer he couldn't refuse. And that's not true. He could have refused. It's just the consequences of refusing were quite significant. So we end up with this forced choice rather than. So when people say, "Oh, I didn't really have a choice in the matter," it's you did. You just one was worse than the other.
Yeah. So there is always a choice. Remember, everyone, there is always a choice. But the problem is we may not like.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other option, not because it doesn't exist, but it's because it may not be very good for us, or it may not be something that we think we can deal with, or we don't think that it will feel good. But there's always a choice, for sure, even though it's not perhaps your favorite. Okay. Well, do you think, this has been amazing, David, absolutely amazing. Your insight, your knowledge, your experience. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Sharing those with us. Is there anything that you think we should add? Is there anything you think we haven't covered yet that you would like to add?
Yeah, I think the one thing, as I mentioned before, all development starts with self-development. Sometimes in order to develop, in order to move forward, sometimes we have to have the conversations that we don't want to have, and we have to answer the questions that we don't want to be asked. Sometimes the movement can be painful. Sometimes it can take a while. If something has been in situation for a longer period, the likelihood it's going to be take longer to resolve. Also, the harder it is to change, the more motivation you need to do it. And I would always say that whether it's a coach, a mentor, a counselor, psychotherapist, any other type of therapist, that if you need support to do it, then get support to do it, but also have support within the family, or a friend or somebody that you can just turn around and say, look, I'm going through this period. It would be nice just to have a bit of support, or just go for a coffee, or whatever it is. Because we're back to the not everything that is faced can be changed, but it's not going to change until you face it. And sometimes it is you have to just not want to use American expressions all the time, but bite the bullet and just go, you know what, I'm going to do something about this. But if you are going to do something about it, don't have a big smorgasbord of, right, I'm going to do this, and this. Pick the thing that's most important in your life. What is the thing that's critical for you to work on now, and what are you going to do about it, and what's the impact of not doing it?
Exactly.
Absolutely. There is a photographer called Jared Polin that have an interest in photography. Anyway, long story short, one of the things that he said was, in order to take really good photographs, you have to get up, get out, take lots of photographs, review them, get feedback on them, and keep going through the process, to be able to take really good photographs. And he said, if you don't want to do that as a photographer, amateur or otherwise, that's absolutely fine. There's no problem. That's the decision that you've made. But don't whinge about it afterwards. Don't whinge and say, I'm not taking good photographs, if you're not prepared to do the work in order to. And I remember watching that and thinking, you know what? That is exactly the same for anything that you want to change in any aspect of your life. You either decide to live with that, okay, or you decide to do something about it. You just don't whinge about it and go, oh well, you're like, I wish. You're like, if you're not making the effort to do something.
Yeah, and it does take work to change, doesn't it? To change the pathways.
And we all whinge. I mean, you're like, there are lots of things I
Right?
whinge about, but I'm not prepared to do anything about it.
Thank you so much, David. And I also would like to wish you a Merry Christmas.
Thank you. Yes, I wish everybody, wherever you are, all the best for the festive season.
Yes, a happy Christmas, everyone, and a wonderful new year. Thank you for listening. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you all enjoyed it. And thank you, David.
You're very welcome.